Hello, everyone. I'm Jeremy Meiss. I am the Director of DevRel and Community at Solace, and great to be here today for the next hour and a half. I hopefully will have all of your attention. It's not an hour and a half, it's really only 40 minutes. I felt all of you kind of go, he's not supposed to do, yeah. So we're going to be talking about event-driven architectures, and then kind of this need for event management and how we've taken API management and how that works and adopt it, and we're going to take that, and there's this industry move towards adopting kind of a more event-driven perspective. So we'll kind of jump right on into that. So event, the Latin comes from eventus. It's where we get the English word event. I'm not sure what it is in other languages. I should have checked that. But it is essentially an occurrence or an outcome. It's something that happens or is regarded as happening, or the outcome or issue. Pretty simple for the term there. It's the term event-driven is a little slightly less old, previous one being in the 1500s. And I kind of jotted down this description, and go ahead and it's the process of allowing digital events that happen in your enterprise to travel through your distributed systems in real time and interact with a variety of applications in different environments. So the goal with event-driven is to drive operational efficiencies, make better decisions, spur innovation, and ultimately serve customers better. Big, long description around event-driven. All right, so our lives are event-driven. If you think about the things that we do, how many of you feel like your life is always driven by some event that's always happening? You're always making decisions off of events. Show of hands. All of you, the rest of you live very boring lives, evidently. Event-driven, it's not just a technical thing, it is really just a personal one. It's something that we deal with on a daily basis. For example, in preparing to give this talk, I had to make my travel arrangements. And so, my credit card was swiped. Luckily, it went through, and that was an event. And that happened. What that event did is it brought up other things in the background that had to happen. So, things like checking to make sure that I had available credit, which luckily I did, and then it goes from there. It is checking to see if there's fraud. Am I making a transaction from a different country than I normally do? It's checking all of these. That's an event that now has some asynchronous things that are happening after, as a result of doing that initial credit card swipe. But all of those things are done in real time. How many of you have ever gotten a text message saying there is fraudulent charges that have happened on your card, or did you just make that $1,000 purchase at Walmart or Tesco or any of the other stores? Okay, I have, and I chuckle every once in a while when that happens, because I can just imagine what the computer's thinking of, why am I spending $1,000 at Walmart? Don't ask, I have kids. So the other thing is, who's ever had a flight that's been delayed? Okay, so a lot more hands have gone up. That could be from either something like a weather issue, could be a strike for those that might be flying on Lufthansa here soon. Hopefully not, but traffic congestion, equipment failure. There's all sorts of things that can happen to delay a flight. And that delay comes from an event that has triggered something to say there's going to be a problem. And so you might get an email, or you might get something saying, your phone buzzes and says, oh, you're going to miss your flight, we're going to rebook you. That usually comes from the airline or from the FAA. Might issue something in the U.S. That would say there's a travel advisory, you need to, going to cancel this flight. But there's a number of other things that could be kicked off with that flight. So in the case of Delta, I've had flights delayed, and before I've even landed, I've already received a notification saying, hey, you're going to miss your next flight. We're going to automatically rebook you on another flight that's happening. And it's all done in the background. It's all been kicked off because they now know I'm going to miss that flight. There's other things that what could be interesting is that if not only that flight's been rebooked, but what if that event were also to notify, partner hotels that maybe I've said in my, profile, my travel profile, that I also stay at Marriott hotels or at Hilton, that it would, and I've put in, here's my confirmation number. What if that event kicked off, not only it rebooks my flight, but it lets my hotel know that this guest is going to either not be able to stay that night because of a travel issue, or they're going to be getting in much later than they normally would. That could then, the hotel would know ahead of time. Then, the hotel's been notified, and then maybe as the plane lands, so again, that's an event that's happening. The plane is landing, getting to the gate. They're now notified that I'm in, Seattle or wherever I'm going to, and they're calculating based off of the traffic when I should arrive, and, automatically they'll check me into the hotel. And then they activate the virtual key card in the app, so it's all ready, and I don't even have to stop by the front desk, and I'm already cleared all the way through. All of that can be triggered by events. If we think about it, when we're doing our development, when we're creating our applications, when we're working with business process, events happen. So when you get in an elevator, across the street at the Best Western, you get in, you have to swipe your card, your room key in order to go to any room. Hopefully it works, or you look like me swiping it and trying to push the button and it not working, but it's because I'm just an idiot. You got to hold it there. So when you do that, it triggers checks to make sure that I'm valid to be in that room or that floor, and then allows me to go up there. But what if that hotel also had things that when I swipe, it also, maybe it sends me a text message or in the app itself for that hotel and says, hey, thanks for showing up. We noticed that you're here late. Would love to, do you want us to schedule breakfast to be delivered tomorrow morning? Or, hey, here's a 2-for-1 drink at the bar. Or multiple different things could be given to me based off an event that happened. Multiple events that have now led to this point of me getting to the hotel. Maybe it asks me if I want a wake-up call. So in a little bit more real, going into some different use cases around event-driven architectures, digital manufacturing. So we're seeing event-driven architecture helping manufacturing kind of blur that line between their IT and their operational technology. So things like, which would be things like robots that help make that car or help drive automation and different controls. And in this kind of industry, we're seeing this move of IoT data, device data between buildings and between sometimes different fleets and different containers. The Singapore, one of the largest ports, busiest ports in the world, they've put IoT sensors on every single container that moves through their port, so they know exactly where it is at all times. Automation that's happening. A lot of the technical problems that are faced within this digital manufacturing comes down to large connection counts. They're processing a lot of data streams at once, and in having to deal with command and control. And so when all of your operational technology has these IoT devices that are embedded in them, all that tech can actually act as additional data sources for your IT to be able to start building these event-driven architecture and event-driven decisions that happen. So in here, you kind of see you got these physical lines that are identifying certain processes that are happening between between vehicles, between factories, going to the different places that are consuming these events to make decisions. Another example would be like financial services. Financial services companies use event-driven architecture to power things like their OMS and trading platforms, FX trading, payment processing, market data, stock tickers. All of those things are event-driven, and a number of the problems that they face is beating the latency of their competitors. They've got extreme message volumes. They got to make sure it gets there. Low latency. There's the need for like zero message loss. If you think about stock markets, that if a trade is made and they're doing multiple trades in just seconds, if one of those trades doesn't get where it's supposed to be, you can have massive loss of money. You can have economies that can collapse. So there's this need for zero message loss. And so in here you would see some different events happening. So kind of each of these lines can be thought of as an event that's happening, and the gray boxes are representing applications that are consuming those events and making decisions. And all of those respond to inputs from each of those events that happen, making the business decisions along the order flow. And kind of the last little example here would be retail. Event-driven architectures help retailers make a lot of handle a lot of the omni-channel kind of inventory constraints that they have, challenges. They might have issues with inventory updates. Recognizing when there's nothing left in that bin that you're trying to order or that you're trying to buy as a consumer, that they can automatically kick off once it's now empty. They can kick off the order, or it reaches a certain weight because there's 10 items left. So similar to digital manufacturing, they deal with a lot of these same issues, and so event-driven is starting to help. Thinking about events and how to handle them is starting to help these industries. And then, if all the other use cases for kind of event-driven architecture didn't kind of hit home with specifically things that you might be working with, you can think about being event-driven in the simplest form possible, which is the JavaScript on-click event. That is literally the simplest way to think about event-driven, partly because it actually says on-click event in there, but it is something that the user has done that now you have to respond to and make other decisions. So we've kind of identified a lot of what event-driven is, and how this point I'm trying to kind of build around is that events are in our life, and the way that we make decisions ourselves just through events, we can also translate that to the decisions that we make with architecture, with the software we're building, the business decisions we have to make. It affects all of us. So even with all of that, I would wager that not a lot of us are actually building applications that have this mindset around event-driven. Kind of this asynchronous, there's things that are happening constantly. Not a lot of us are actually doing that. So one of the challenges of why we aren't seeing a lot of event-driven decisions being made within development and event-driven architecture is that the developer experience around it is just poor. Organizations that have been successful at doing this, they've had to invest a lot of resources, a lot of time, and a lot of effort, and to develop all of that kind of in-house. And in order to really make that transition, things like AMQP, and it isn't exactly a beautiful protocol. MQTT works, but it isn't as easy to use as REST APIs. And so you really have to kind of want to be event-driven in order to get there. Don't just decide, hey, maybe we'll try and mess with it, because it's a lot of time and effort to try and figure out what are the different events in your business that you should be able to start consuming. The other thing that is kind of a challenge for organizations to become event-driven is this lack of manageability and governance. And lack of manageability in governance is pretty much standard within the industry. Some governance exists, and we need to have that. We need to have the manageability within the event-driven. It's not there yet. Take the case of the FAA and air traffic management. So they have a huge amount of info that they have to deal with and send to airlines in real time so that airlines can make the decisions that they need to. And the weather domain alone, when it comes to the FAA and data points, has over 20,000 different individual events with different sensors at different airports, all with different triggers on those of the different things that should happen. So if the weather has shifted, this amount of degrees, then notifications have to go out, and you might have to issue a weather advisory, and then now it shuts down the airport. Like, there's so many different things that have to happen real-time, asynchronous, that the FAA has to deal with and send to airlines. How do you even figure out, as a developer, what you actually want to consume and the types of insights that you might have and need to make and insights you need to gather in order to make those decisions? That's sort of that lack of manageability and governance that we're kind of seeing right now within these event-driven architectures and event-driven development. And because of that, it really kind of creates this wild, wild west. And if we had more time, if I did have the hour and a half, we could all get up, we could all do the Wild Wild West dance from back in my childhood, but that's not going to hit home very well, so we're not going to do that. However, tonight, maybe we could. So we really have to figure out as an industry how to tame this whole idea of event-driven and deal with some of those challenges. But in spite of all these challenges, we're seeing a lot of customers, a lot of companies that recognize this, and they realize that they've got to respond to events, but it's pretty isolated in how they're doing it. So, for instance, Royal Bank of Canada, they have a low latency trading platform. They're doing over 60 billion, but right now it's about 65 billion transactions a day that they're going through their trading platform, all event driven. And one could say that they're successful within capital markets in doing this, but they're not, as an entire company and an entire organization, they're not as event-driven as they could be. They've only kind of tackled the capital market piece. They haven't the trading piece. They haven't looked at any of the other retail functions. They've just looked at one small bit. Another example would be the Nets Pay system in Singapore. And what they've been looking to provide is kind of that easier consumer experience, so that when they go and pay, giving the banks as much information as possible about the customer journey as they're going and buying different products within Singapore, letting that influence a lot of the decisions the bank and payment processing makes. And they're obviously successful, but they're still not fully event-driven or as much as they would want to be, but they are getting there. And then Airtel, so one of the largest telcos in India and one of the largest telcos in the world, they were able to kind of decrease the time in which it took to send, to provision a phone from a large number of minutes down to seconds, just by embracing this idea of event-driven and asynchronous transactions that are happening, instead of dealing with REST APIs that kind of just sit there and wait for something to happen. Things are proactively happening based on that one event. And again, they're still not fully event-driven, but they're getting there. So we've seen some movement in the industry around this. So how do we fix this so that everyone can be event-driven, so that every developer, as they're looking at building, they can think about this mindset, just as we've seen with how APIs themselves have grown. APIs aren't going anywhere. And in fact, their importance is really just continuing to grow. When you're building out something for your company, API-first development is becoming this important piece. Thinking about your APIs first when you're doing development instead of developing and doing afterwards. Like, that mindset is now there. But in the category of events in real time and asynchronous, there really isn't this, that same mindset is not there. And there's definitely room for improvement. And so that's what a lot of customers, a lot of different organizations are trying to do to get there. So in order to start to manage events, we need to answer the typical what, where, when, where, how, who, why. I think I got them all there of events. So where do you discover that you have events or topics and the schema definition for the payload that you need to be sending as a developer? What are the logical event address or topics do you need to subscribe to in order to receive just the events you want, not everything that then clouds your decision making with your development? Why does that event even exist? What's its context and purpose? Who do you contact to learn more about the events within your company and their purpose? When will a given event be available or deprecated? How do you manage that total life cycle of an event, and how do devs and architects define their event-driven app interfaces? How do you generate the necessary code like you would with things like OpenAPI? But also, I think it's important to recognize that REST and the whole API management ecosystem, they've already solved a lot of this. They've already looked at a lot of answering these the who, what, when, where, why, and how. You have API gateways, which is that runtime asset that kind of helps proxy these APIs, and there's API portals, which are which a lot of us have used out there, that help us look at the documentation that enables it and understand how we're gonna build out the API ecosystem. You can do the analysis to know what are the most used and even least used endpoints and services, and even the performances of those services. And then finally, you're able to communicate and collaborate around the APIs in your org, all from that API management system. But we don't have that for events yet. There we go. So for a while now, we've been working with we've been doing, as a company, we've been in the industry, there's been a lot of it, message brokers that are out there. PubSub has been around a while, continues to be there in different forms. And what we're starting to see is, again, this need for real time. And so we in the industry, we've kind of completely ignored kind of that design, development, and management time from event-driven APIs. And so what we're looking to do with a number of different companies and organizations right now is do the exact same type of things that we've done with APIs, and go towards a management framework, much like what OpenAPI has done from an industry perspective, is setting up those standards and how you deal with APIs and how you put together the schemas and use machine-readable information so that the developers can get back to doing what they do best. So kind of this third thing we need to do is we need to model our event-driven enterprises and our event-driven landscape. There are a couple of foundational elements that kind of come into play when you're building out your event-driven architectures within your company. So first, you've got to have the domain. So if you think about a world where you have an event portal and you can define your application domains, which are just ways in which you look at your enterprise. Maybe it's a line of business within a bank, for instance. So you might have wealth management, you might have securities or retail. Looking at those, the way that you would set up those application domains. And then within those different domains, you're going to have different payload schemas because the data is going to be different. And so, you might have Excel schemas, XML, you've got JSON, Avro, but then you've got to define that event. So you got the schemas, now you've got to define the event, and the event's going to have the payload, and what's going to be in that payload, and how's your API going to handle this asynchronously. So for instance, like the case of the FAA, again, there are a lot of schemas that they've built, but in one particular case, airlines were very confused because there were 3 different events which all looked the same, but they all actually had a different field in there, and the airlines were going back to the FAA with one of those like, what? If I had a WTF, I could do a WTF GIF, but I didn't get there. And that's what we're talking about, though, with providing context to your events, and so that your developers know how to handle that information and build APIs accordingly. And so once you've got the event, and then we're also talking about defining the application. What's that asynchronous interface? What are you consuming? What are you producing with that application? Once you kind of have this model, though, and this is ultimately what we're working within the industry to try and do, is you're able to track all of the relationships between all of the different events within your company, all the different domains, applications, schemas, and be able to put those all together into an application which is producing that event. And then allow that, you have someone else that's consuming that. And able to produce a new event, which then can be consumed within your company or by customers. And that just continues on, that whole process of consuming events, producing events. And the ability to view all of that that's happening, we don't really have that right now, like we would within like the REST APIs and Open API. So that is where, how many of you have heard of AsyncAPI? There's, okay, so 5 or 6. So AsyncAPI is started to come up over the last couple of years. And it's kind of this natural extension of driving towards being event-driven and building business context around data. Is we need to have this machine-readable application spec that once you've put all of the pieces together and build out your event-driven architecture, you can now output it into something that can be used to build your API and that your developers can know what they're supposed to be doing. And you as a developer can take that and implement the event-driven, not only event-driven architecture, but just the event-driven application due to event-driven development. And so that goes from documentation to code generation to discovery. Again, the same basic stuff that we've had with REST APIs, but we haven't had with asynchronous transactions. All right, so we've been working with AsyncAPI themselves, and I really, like I mentioned, for those that haven't heard about it, I really encourage you to go out there. It's asyncapi.com, and also you can look at the spec as it's being built, multiple different repositories at github.com/asyncapi, and we're a proud contributor to the spec. Slack, MuleSoft, Salesforce, SAP, other large organizations are also seeing this need for event-driven, and so they've also been contributing to the spec. It is open source, and so anyone can contribute, help build that out. Highly encourage you to go out and read about it. And we're also working directly with the team there to kind of build out these code generators that can make it a lot easier for you to export what you're defining, bring that out so that now you have a schema that you can work with. And so one of the things that we're doing, so this is what the AsyncAPI kind of schema looks like. And so you have these things called channels, and in this world it kind of relates to topics, and then you define what the action is that you're going to do, either publish or subscribe. And then finally, the message definition down there is comes out of that channel of what is it that you're defining. So I wanted to walk you through as we've looked at kind of what these examples are, and show you some actual some of the code generator bits of how we're working to do this with AsyncAPI, and building out some portals. So first thing, as you want to create this application domain, and this is just really just an example of what you would follow with an event portal type of thing to build out, not necessarily something that exists right now, but is in the process of, like I said, being worked on with the community. So you have the application domains. You kind of take those enterprise, I mentioned earlier about taking them into line of business, or even different dev teams. Maybe they're working on certain things within the agile framework. You have different governance policies that might be in place for events being consumed across kind of your app boundaries, app domain boundaries, and so you got to really define those. Understanding the interaction between app domains and how before you can do this, you've got to answer that question of how are you going to interact. And again, it's not much different than you would do with an API, but within events, it's got to be thinking about that. And then you're going to have to have a uniform root topic for all of the events that happen. And then schemas. You start to build out your schemas, represent that payload content in a way that the machine itself, the programs can use to build out your APIs. And naturally there'll be support for JSON, Avro, XML, blob if you want to have a blob format, freeform text, binary payload with blob. the ability for it to be fully version controlled, and we've seen that within APIs, within REST API management systems, that you're able to go back and look at your data, and then you make a change and you realize that didn't work. Well, you just go back, just roll back. And then having a UI that kind of provides an IDE experience so that you can validate it immediately on there. It's one of the things we felt is really important as we're working with AsyncAPI to do that. And then as you start looking at the events and figuring them out and identify what's going to be in that metadata, enable you to kind of control the sharing. Who's going to have access to this? Is this something that's only local? Is this something that would be an external event that might be influenced by other decisions that are being made? And then you can also build out access control lists for an event broker, depending on what you have, what you're using, be able to control who has access to that entire broker. And again, that would still be fully version controlled as well. And then the types of applications that you typically would kind of see are going to be microservices that would be using this. You'd have maybe a web app. You would have different functions, maybe cloud functions that are there, Azure, integration with Kafka, with NoSQL databases, Dell Boomi, other kind of systems that are helping you integrate with your data with other data points. And then you would want to define the event-driven application itself, the interface. So what is that application going to consume? What's it going to publish? What's it going to produce? So that you know what are the other systems that have to consume that data or have to produce it. That way you've mapped it all out. And then having that application metadata for that, again, we go back to that management and governance of understanding exactly what is happening, what data is being driven, what's it going to do, answer all of those who, what, when, where, how, why type of questions. And again, still making sure that that's version controlled. And then being able to visualize that. Once you've built out, being able to visualize, much like you would with a network topography, be able to visualize everything that's happening with your applications, your events, your schemas, and be able to see what events are available that you might not know, that lets your architects and even developers be able to see what they can go out and consume, be able to filter that by a use case. That would be an example. And also will help, having a visualization will help you understand, that event-driven choreography between the different systems, so that, and across application domains, so that you're making the right decisions. And then generate it, again, ways that you can download the YAML, might be able to, look at the different API or AsyncAPI specs. The 2.0 just came out, so the option, for 1.0, 2.0 would be preferred. And this would be an example of what the code would be generated that you can instantly go and use to help build out your APIs. Put that in and start building, letting your developers and that are architecting those systems, the event-driven architecture, it's set. So that's kind of, hopefully answers a lot of the questions about what event-driven architecture is, where the industry is right now, where it's going, how to be event-driven, and that's that. Definitely check us out here. AsyncAPI, I highly encourage you to go out there, see what they have, see what questions are currently being thought about, and the code generators and such that we're working to create. And you can find me on Twitter, and I will be back. I'll be off to the side if you have any questions. Thank you.